So, hi everyone. I'm Carissa Patron. I'm the Equity Program Manager for the West Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, and I'm pleased to welcome you all here today for this really great panel. For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, the Forum is a collaboration of businesses and institutions dedicated to promoting sustainable business practices within the focus areas of climate leadership, social resilience, social justice, and the circular economy. So today we're excited to present a webinar on the state's cannabis industry and have a conversation around the various struggles the state has faced when translating its legal status and economic opportunity into prosperity, equity, and sustainability. So I would like to thank Good for Michigan for their support in developing this program, along with Alice Jasper, who is the Good for Michigan Program Director, for co-moderating this panel with me today. If you find this program valuable, I hope that you'll join us for some of our online upcoming webinar discussions as well. Next week, our webinar will focus around advancing health equity and social justice along the West Michigan Lakeshore, which will include 4 local speakers who will share their perspectives on current impacts to physical and mental health around the intersection of health equity and social justice and the need for holistic change. So please also keep an eye out for our climate resiliency forums that will be coming up later on this month into September as well. And lastly, the forum will be hosting the Michigan Campus Sustainability Collaborative Earth Day 50.5 on October 22nd, which will be a statewide virtual conference recognizing the 50th anniversary of Earth Day that really encompasses learning and education for students, faculty, and staff, and alumni on college campuses across Michigan. So you will receive a link to the video from today's program, along with a short feedback survey and any additional notes that will come out of today's program in an email following the webinar. So this and a series of all of our programs are primarily funded through membership donations. And if you are not yet a member of our organization and would like to do so, please consider becoming one. We offer both individual and corporate memberships. So you can contact Rose or info@WMSBF for more information. And you might also be interested in learning about our various working groups where a lot of our work happens, including the Sustainability and Equity Working Group that will meet next on Monday, August 17th, the Climate Leadership Council, Prosperous Economy Working Group, among others. So please email us to get involved with any of our working groups if you so choose to do so. So now I would like to recognize that I have the privilege of introducing our dynamic panelists today, including Margeaux Bruner, who is the Director of Compliance and Diversity for Red, White, and Bloom, among a lot of other hats that she wears that she'll talk about. Next is Tami VandenBerg, who is the organizer and a funder of Decriminalize Grand Rapids, along with the co-owner of the Meanwhile in the Pyramid Scheme, and board member of the West Michigan Cannabis Guild. And lastly, we have Margeaux, who is the corporate impact strategist and legal compliance manager for Flourish, along with the executive director for the Black and Brown Cannabis Guild, co-founder of Equity Pack as well. So thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about this conversation. So for our attendees, please note that you can share your thoughts with all the panelists or just the attendees through the chat function. You can also ask questions through the Q&A field as well. So we'll have time at the end for a few questions and answers from our panelists, but now I would like to pass it over to Alice.
Thanks so much, Carissa. My name is Alice Jasper, and thanks so much to the forum for hosting this conversation, and for all of our panelists for joining us today. We appreciate you and your time and your knowledge. So would you mind, each of you, kind of sharing a bit about the work that you do and all the various hats that you wear with regards to the cannabis industry, both, whether that work is based in Michigan or if it's Michigan and nationally. Margeaux, would you kick it off for us and introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do? Margeaux, I think you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I am the Director of Compliance and Diversity Inclusion for Red, White, and Bloom. Red, White, and Bloom, their footprint expands beyond Michigan. We are currently subject to closing in Michigan, Illinois, Massachusetts, with California and Florida coming on as well. Prior to and we also recently entered into a deal with High Times. Prior to, I'm also a board of director member for the Minority Cannabis Business Association. And so we are responsible for drafting policy nationally that is a trade association that is basically rooted in the cannabis industry, but has an additional call to justice and equity and economic empowerment. And we do that through the creation of both national policy, and we do weigh in on some municipal issues as well. I just recently completed my term with the Marijuana Regulatory Agency's Laura Work Group. I have been a member of Attorney General Dana Nessel's Policy Work Group, and I was previously appointed to the Michigan State Police Impaired Driving Committee, where we did a 13-month study that dove into what is impairment in the state of Michigan. And it also, last but not least, brought adult use legalization to Michigan through Proposal 1.
Great, thank you so much, Margeaux. Next, if we could take it over to you, Tami, would you be willing to share a bit about the work that you've done in the cannabis industry space with regards to policy and organizing, both West Michigan and statewide?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for putting together this discussion. Really, really critical to be talking about this. We need to talk about this a lot more. A little bit about my history. I've been a drug policy reformer for about, I was trying to think, 20 years. I think 20 years ago I got into this, and came into it through being a housing activist, and saw very quickly, working with people living on the streets, that drug policy was a massive issue, and the drug war was very much part of the reason so many people were homeless. Also seeing the disparities in arrests and charges, and really fought for a lot of my clients who had used drugs in the past. Worked to try to change housing policies around subsidized housing, which we didn't have a lot of luck with that. And subsidized housing, as many of you know, screens out people with any type of drug charge, and even if it's from a very, very long time ago. So we started working with organizations to try to change these policies. Nonprofits and housing organizations were extremely reluctant to do that. We went through fair housing and found out that drug users and people with law enforcement interaction in their past were not any kind of protected class, and so they wouldn't touch it. So eventually I just started thinking, you know, why is this illegal anyway? Why is cannabis even illegal? You know, all kinds of people are using it. All my friends are using it. They're not getting picked up. Other people are getting picked up. This is really bananas. And so kind of changed my focus to changing the laws, and got involved with the Drug Policy Alliance, Harm Reduction Coalition, and eventually my colleague Michael Tuffelmeyer and myself ran the DecriminalizeGR campaign in 2012, which people thought we were completely crazy, and there was absolutely no way the city of Grand Rapids, if you're familiar with West Michigan, as I think this is a statewide panel, but West Michigan has a very, very conservative religious history, and the level of stigma around drugs in these parts is through the roof compared to so many other cities I've experienced and countries. So to everyone's shock, we won overwhelmingly in 2012, and then the powers that be fought it in court for the next couple of years, but we did end up winning decisively. Since that time, I've been involved with Proposal 1 also. I served as a board member of MILegalize in 2018, and that was probably one of the most meaningful experiences of my life, working with folks all over the state to get that passed. Traveled to all kinds of places I'd never been, which was really fun, and met so many fantastic people. And we won decisively, which is fantastic. Since that time, I have co-founded the West Michigan Cannabis Guild and serve as co-chair of that entity. I also applied for a license myself and was denied for that license back in April. So that's a little bit about my background and condensed, very condensed involvement with trying to end marijuana prohibition, as well as lots of other drug policy reform.
Thank you so much, Tami. And last but certainly not least, Navia, could you tell us a little bit about the work that you do, especially around Flourish and the work that you've been doing around Expungement and the Black and Brown Cannabis Guild?
Absolutely. Well, I want to start by saying these two are very hard acts to follow. Just this is an incredible group of women on this panel. I feel like I'm here to speak to it, but also learn. So this is amazing. So my background is primarily in I've been a long-standing advocate for diversity, inclusion, and equity work. My background is all the way back just here to Grand Rapids, where I'm based, but another West Michigan Sustainable Business Forum community, Benton Harbor. And growing up in Benton Harbor, a primarily small Black community, I watched people very close to me, friends and families that were detrimentally impacted by the war on drugs. I never perceived marijuana to be very harmful, but I also understood that you just couldn't do it just because the system said you couldn't, right? And the impacts of that were profound on me even at a young age. And so I'm from Benton Harbor. I have a key to the city of Benton Harbor. I did all types of really fun advocacy stuff back in those fun days before moving to Grand Rapids and getting involved politically. I've always been a systems level thinker, a systems level activist. And so when I came to Grand Rapids, I kind of got connected to leaders here who were passionate about diversity initially. And what that turned into was me starting my own consulting firm, basically to assist elected officials, candidates, and campaigns in ascending to elected office so that they could facilitate change. One of the issues with that I discovered while working with judges, state house representatives, school board members, county candidates, was just that the pipeline was broken. For a regular individual to ascend to elected office, there was just so many systemic barriers. And so I started working to address those barriers. I started a radio show. It was pretty grassroots. It was called Political Pulse. I'm the only Black-owned entity for like 2 years. And I had the pleasure of talking to brilliant people like Tami about her work in cannabis, and people like Pat Miles being appointed by Barack Obama. And then I also helped co-found Equity PAC, which was another piece of the systemic three-prong approach to the pipeline for leaders. And through Equity PAC, we raised money and we supported equity-minded individuals and to increase their winnability so that they could ascend to elected office. I got approached about 1.5 years ago, almost 2 years ago now, by someone who was like, hey, the work that your consulting firm does, bringing this lens for equity and inclusion and outreach to leaders could really be beneficial to this burgeoning cannabis industry. And so as I learned about the regulatory compliance and licensing, for municipalities, I realized that there was just this huge opportunity to advance and amplify the needs of our neighborhood associations, our neighborhood groups, our community organizations who are really afraid of cannabis, who are really nervous about big money coming from, wherever they felt it hailed from, California and Colorado, to kind of change the face of their neighborhoods. And I realized that there was a lack of education. And so my consulting firm first was working with, at the time, the largest medical marijuana license holder in the state of Michigan. And so I got really familiar with licensing, with regulatory compliance, and I started facilitating these community plans to positively impact neighborhoods. And so after that, I realized as a consultant, it wasn't just the best position to hold companies accountable for fulfilling all the promises that they were making to the neighborhoods. And so what I did was I started networking with others all over the state of Michigan, working with folks like Director Andrew Brisboe, coming to different conferences where I learned about how on the east side of the state, they were doing incredible work in expungement. And I was super jealous. I was like, why do we not have a robust arm of expungement resources in West Michigan? And so me and one of my really close friends, brilliant entrepreneur, Ariana Waller, started the Black and Brown Cannabis Guild so that we could bring expungement resources to the west side of the state. And so
Looks like Denavia froze. Did she freeze for you? Okay. That's all right. Well, hopefully we can come back to her and she can kind of get tapped back in soon. But we can maybe just shift to the next question if that works for y'all. So thanks so much for introducing yourselves. Could you maybe speak to, oh, she back? No. So could you maybe speak to some of the barriers that we see as the cannabis industry is expected to grow exponentially and become a major economic force in the state? But there are a lot of barriers to growth and equal opportunity to get engaged in the space. So could you maybe speak to what those barriers are and give us a brief introduction of local and state policy solutions that might help to address some of those barriers? And if there are any pain points within the current policies that still need to be addressed. And maybe we'll take that, start with you, Margeaux, and then Tami can take it.
The first thing is that there's a huge lens right now because cannabis is new and it's an industry that none of us have ever seen the end of prohibition. And this particular prohibition, unlike alcohol, comes with a lot of racial strife because cannabis is a substance that was used to disproportionately arrest, criminalize, separate from resources in a multitude of ways people of color. But as a person of color that speaks in this space and sees, a really large landscape, I think that it's unfair to exclusively focus this on cannabis. All of the policy and all of the talk about social equity is essentially acknowledging some of the harm and creating one policy that is expected to undo hundreds of years of oppression. And that is a heavy lift for cannabis to do. So if you look at the history of cannabis itself, people of color are disproportionately arrested, sometimes at the rate of the average per the ACLU, about 4 times average. But in some cities like Grand Rapids, I believe the average was as much as 15 times that of their non-people of color. So I think that we need to address that and address what does an arrest look like. An arrest looks like a criminal record. A criminal record can disenfranchise you from economic opportunities as far as employment. It can disenfranchise you from housing. It can disenfranchise you from educational opportunities. And so all of that has to go into the pot. I don't think it's possible to create one policy that undoes all of the things that have happened. Another part of it is the disproportionate distribution of wealth. So cannabis is a very high capital raise. And I've seen, a really large landscape. And, right now I'm with an MSO that is, on the stock market. So that's a little bit different. But even when I would come to people in the state of Michigan and say, people who are approaching 1 license or 2 licenses, well, where did you come up with the resources? Because this is federally legal, so you can't go to a bank for a loan. And people who traditionally did not go the route of raising capital, many people would say, well, I just went to my family. And you just went to your family and were able to garner millions of dollars to start a new business. And that does not always happen in communities of color. So I think that acknowledging that this is an entire systematic issue that doesn't just focus on the lens of cannabis. But when it comes to the state of Michigan, there are a number of complexities. One, we have a fully legal market, both adult use and medical, and we don't have a path to expungement. Even if I create a path to expungement, that does not necessarily mean that you're interested in participating in the industry or that you will have access to the industry through ownership, because licensing is not limited at a state level, but licensing is capped in most municipalities. So there are only a fixed number of licenses that are going to go around. And that causes the price of real estate to rise and a number of economic factors. So I think just looking really heavily at the entire economic landscape of America today and the history of that is the first step that we can take in creating any policy around this particular space.
Thanks so much, Margeaux and Tami. I'm glad that you're back. Give you a moment to kind of plug back in and make sure you're good, and maybe we can pass it off to Tami to answer.
Yeah, I would second every single thing that Margeaux said. I think I have a long list, so I'll be very brief. So access to information, you know, Grand Rapids, basically every property that was eligible was snatched up before a huge part of the city even knew what was going on, or how to even get into the market or how to get a license. Exclusionary zoning. I was reading, I've been learning a lot about exclusionary zoning, and in terms of if you need to hire your own urban planner to even find a piece of real estate for like 50 grand, you know, that's exclusionary. You know, who just has 50 grand sitting around to hire a professional urban planner to help you navigate this unbelievably complicated zoning that we have. It's, you know, it's everywhere, but specifically Grand Rapids, where I live, you know, all these different sensitive uses, and how do you define a sensitive use, and how does their input play in? So that whole thing has just been extremely complicated and knocked out a huge portion of the population. Capital requirements, of course, are immense. Access to real estate, as Margeaux said, the fewer licenses available in any one municipality or township, the prices skyrocket. In Grand Rapids, people were paying 3 times market value. You know, who can pay 3 times market value? And the neighborhoods that are zoned in are primarily commercial districts. My neighborhood, Easttown, is zoned out. We actually have some small buildings, you know, so people might actually be able to afford smaller buildings as opposed to these giant commercial buildings in industrial districts and commercial districts. Lots of communities just opting out entirely, you know, zero opportunity for anybody in a lot of cities, including Kentwood, Wyoming, all kinds of cities where the populace voted overwhelmingly for Proposal 1, and the people in charge just decided, well, we don't like it, so we're not doing it, regardless of what the voters said. Racism at every level of every system. No banking. Again, my family doesn't have wealth. I don't have access to $1 million, but a lot of white people do. But in terms of banking, that's a huge issue. Expungements is an issue. And yeah, those are just a handful of things that have, and in terms of solutions, I think lots and lots of education. Stigma is really, really big. Some of the stuff I've heard at planning commission meetings is just astounding. People talking about dead bodies out in front of dispensaries. And I mean, it is, reefer madness is real. And there are so many people that still buy into that craziness. And in all fairness, we're dealing with, 90 years of propaganda and misinformation. And so just working on that stigma piece, and that's significant as well. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Tami. And yeah, Danavia, could you?
Yeah, I think they said a lot of the big ones. I think the question was just focused on local and state, but I think federally descheduling marijuana is going to be important. Obviously, banking is really important. I think those issues that present themselves as normal barriers to any entrepreneur are so compounded when it comes to entrepreneurs of color that it's really near impossible to foster something and like some policy outcomes that are equitable without addressing some of those really high barriers for everyone. And then specifically when it comes to barriers for, in my opinion, what I see for people of color, after our expungement fair last year, we had dozens of people reaching out to us asking how do they get into the cannabis industry. And some of those hurdles, especially in West Michigan, were around cities that weren't opting in to marijuana, just like Tami said, because of stigma. I knew a lot of entrepreneurs that were in cities that were really negatively impacted by the war on drugs. And I tell people, every war has casualties, right? When it's an unjust war, you pay the casualties some type of reparations, right? And America does a great job at that for anyone but victims of the war on drugs, it seems like. And so communities like Flint, Benton Harbor, Grand Rapids, where I saw large numbers of people reaching out, asking how do they get into the industry, they couldn't find property within a city that would opt into marijuana. Even at present, the cities that are opting into allowing licensing oftentimes are doing so without embedding a policy lens that's equitable. They're just using a lot of the buzzwords. So they all claim to have social equity programs, but none of those programs have license set-asides for people that were harmed by the war on drugs. They have really rigorous hurdles. So like in the city of Grand Rapids, I think it's like you have to have been a resident of Grand Rapids for 10 consecutive years between like 1970 something and like 2016 or 18. And even for people that I know who are working in the cannabis industry right now, who left and went away for college, came back, things like that, for whatever reason they don't qualify, right? Or people that I know who have multiple felonies, who have worked with the state of Michigan to get permission to be in the industry, they don't qualify, even though there's a current like quote social equity program in place. A lot of cities are doing like cities like Grand Rapids did and saying, we're going to allow licensing for everything, and we're going to expect micro businesses to be the license type that fosters racial equity, when in reality, micro businesses just aren't as sustainable as they need to be, especially for folks who have experience as a caregiver. And so those are real barriers. I would say immediately what we really need in cities like Grand Rapids that are going to be pro-marijuana is a little bit of deregulation around properties, right? Tami touched on this, the sensitive land uses, the waivers, those things are really costly and confusing. If I want to start a business, I should be able to find a property and start that business. And then once I have to operate, right? Once I jump over the hurdles of getting licensed, I should be able to access information on how to sustain a viable business. And that's difficult too in marijuana. It's almost like a good old boys club sometimes, where all the knowledge around how your supply chain works with growing, cultivating, best practice in retail, best practice in insurance and banking, those things just aren't available to most entrepreneurs, especially entrepreneurs of color. And so right now we need more incubators, more mentorship programs like the ones that we're working on now, more pipelines for jobs specifically. And then, yeah, just real equitable policy that targets people with cannabis convictions and people with adverse impacts because of cannabis prohibition.
Thank you all for your really thoughtful answers. This is a really important conversation. So we know that recreational possession and use of marijuana was approved in Michigan in 2018, but there are many individuals, as you all have touched on a little bit, who are still incarcerated or live with criminal records for offenses that would be legal today. So there are even some cases of folks who are currently serving 60-year sentences, or other folks who have even been recently sentenced to over 16 years in federal prison for operating outside of the marijuana law, but in Michigan. So continuously we see that Black and brown folks have been and are still disproportionately impacted by the prohibition of marijuana and the war on drugs. Could you all speak a little bit about what you're working at currently to address some of these issues and disparities in Michigan?
Is it okay if I start this one?
Yeah,
that was like the call I was on right before this panel was about this. Right now, Flourish and the Black and Brown Cannabis Guild are working with the Last Prisoner Project in the Roll It Up for Justice program, specifically around Michael Thompson, the gentleman who was sentenced to serve, like you said, close to 60 years in jail for selling 3 pounds of marijuana to an undercover cop back in the 90s. This gentleman became a client of the Last Prisoner Project, and there were celebrities all over the country calling for his release. And over 130,000 emails were sent to the governor's office. And this gentleman is up for clemency, and it still has not been granted. And then most recently, the development has been that this gentleman has contracted coronavirus. And we have been continually calling for his release. Because this is just, again, another casualty of really, really harsh punishment for something today that would not be legal and would not be dealt with that way. And so we're calling for the release of Michael Thompson. That information is available on all platforms right now. If you go to Flourish, any of our social media or website, there's links to the governor's office number, email, so that you can call for Michael Thompson's release. And then at a systems level, some of the work that I think we have to do to address these issues and disparities in Michigan is continuing to reverse the constantly compounding impact of people who have cannabis convictions. I say it all the time that 1 in 3 Michigan families has someone in their family with a conviction, right? And the impacts of those crimes on their everyday life. Every time they apply for a job, they have to disclose that. Every time they want a scholarship, every time they want to do anything, they have to disclose that. And so over criminalization of things that are harmless, we really need to be peeling back in Michigan. And so right now there's a package of expungement bills moving through Michigan that would make expungement automatic, which is something that I've been working with some legislators on right now. We need people to be pushing on Peter Lucido's committee to move that package of expungement bills forward. This September, we're going to continue to be doing expungement fairs all over the state of Michigan. I'm super excited to be working with the city of Grand Rapids, with the governor's office to do that. We need more partners in that work. Also, we need cannabis companies to be intentional about creating job opportunities for the ones who don't want to be entrepreneurs in cannabis. I think Margeaux touched on it in her opening remarks about how 400 years of slavery and 1 million years of racism is not going to be dismantled by just one industry and in one day and in one policy outcome. But I do believe that there's a multi-pronged approach that we should be taking. Companies like Flourish, where I work, we're a larger company. We leverage our ability as the second largest cultivator of marijuana in the state of Michigan, with factories in multiple cities to create pipelines for jobs for people of color, especially people harmed by the war on drugs. When people want to learn about cannabis, we need to be there to provide resources for them. I tell people to call me, to reach out to me over email, because if you're someone who wants to have a space in this industry and one of the hurdles is not understanding how to navigate, we can eliminate that quickly, right? We have the resources to do that. I'm always looking for more partners that are going to do that as well, and so is the state of Michigan. Though soon, the Marijuana Regulatory Agency will be launching a resource arm to their website soon. Flourish, the Black and Brown Cannabis Guild, and others have committed to being a part of that program to create a pipeline for information on how to get into the cannabis industry and how to stay in it, how to be successful and profitable in it, so that we can end this notion of we're all kind of competing and kind of all support each other. And so that's just a few of the things that I think we can be doing right now on a personal level and on a professional level in this industry and otherwise.
Yeah, thanks for all of that really important information. Margeaux or Tami, would you like to weigh in on that question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was originally a founding member of National Expungement Week. And during National Expungement Week last year, there were 43 events in 30 cities. I hosted 5 events in the state of Michigan, 4 expungement fairs, and 1 legislative policy discussion. And one thing that I can say that as a total lessons learned in year 2, and having come into contact with over 900 clients, is that expungement fairs are not necessarily the best process for this. During one of the partners for National Expungement Week is Code for America. They have their Clear My Record software. I am a Code for America volunteer. I am on their Code for Congress Brigade. I believe emphatically that automatic expungement is the only way to do expungement. It's just a huge barrier for a person to have to endure criminalization. And even through the assistance of expungement fair, if I fill out your paperwork and if I help you get your fingerprints, you still are going to be responsible for filing that with your local clerk. You're still going to be responsible for serving the Attorney General. You're still going to be responsible for appearing before a judge and or magistrate and representing yourself. And there's just like a lot of places where that can fall through the cracks. And it just still takes a lot of time and energy and effort when we have the technology and the resources to just flip a switch. The state of Illinois, on January 1st, they expunged 11,000 records. It is also very low cost to do an automatic expungement as opposed to clogging the system of justice, especially now after, coronavirus, where you can't even walk into a clerk's office and do your filing. You need a superior level of knowledge to do an electronic filing for all of these things. It's extremely complicated and frustrating, and that is the reason why some people don't even participate in fairs, or they come to a fair and they don't follow through, and so they still have the burden of that on their record. I think that it's up to us to advocate for all of that heavy lifting be done so that it's automatic. I think that there is some pushback that is from more a conservative mind of thinking that people should have to quote unquote work for something, or people should have to endure some sort of hardship in order to receive help. And I think that's just like extremely unfair. And so having an awareness of that, definitely in favor of all the expungement bills. Only one of the expungement bills had automatic expungement in it. And the previous iteration of expungement, you still need to petition the court, which is not automatic. Automatic to me means that I woke up and it did not exist anymore. And if you cannot do that, at the very bare minimum, establish a standard that my criminal record is only visible to a law enforcement agency. It doesn't have to be applicable to employment or housing unless your crime involves some sort of dishonesty or violent act. So we've established so many barriers for people that this awareness is the first step, but a slew of policy. It's not going to be one policy. It's going to have to be a complete changing of minds, a complete changing of hearts, and a changing of the guard, quite frankly, in order to see the future that we hope for.
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback on that. You know, the drug war, a lot of folks, there's kind of two schools of thoughts, right? There's the drug war was a massive failure, right? Because the stated reason for the drug war was to reduce use. That's what they said. They wanted to reduce use. Well, it did the opposite of that, right? Drugs are cheaper, more accessible than ever. The second school of thought, which is the Carl Hart school of thought, who's a personal hero of mine, is that the drug war worked exactly as it was designed and was a phenomenal success, because when you look at Anslinger in the 30s, when you look at Nixon in the 60s, when you look at Reagan in the 80s, these laws work to control populations that were seen as problematic, all the way back to the Mexican immigrants, which is where the word marijuana came from, which is why we use cannabis, the word cannabis a lot now, to the anti-war activists and the jazz musicians. And so it's not like folks just kind of accidentally got picked up in this. It's not like somehow. A lot of people have a ridiculous idea that Black people use more drugs than white people. Well, it's not true. The drug war was designed by racist people to control various races. And I've got the new Jim Crow here too, which is another phenomenal resource for people that want to learn more about, once Jim Crow was ended, once prohibition of alcohol was ended, then a lot of those same folks moved on to the drug war. So I think knowing that government needs to take responsibility. I agree. I love what Flourish is doing. I love what Redemption Cannabis is doing. I love what Farmhouse Wellness is doing. I love all of this phenomenal work by some businesses. And I think every business should be doing social equity work and in a meaningful, real way. But you know what? The government put these policies in place, and the government benefited from, look at law enforcement, look at law enforcement budgets, look at jails, look at private prisons, look at prosecutors, look at, these are the folks that created these horrendous policies that are unbelievably expensive and insanely harmful. So one of the things we've been working on is, okay, how are they going to make amends? What are y'all going to do? And again, I absolutely want to continue to pressure businesses, but there's only so many businesses, and there's only so much money they have. If we're looking at real meaningful, call it amends, call it resources, call it reparations, whatever, some type of meaningful way to address the massive harm that's taken place, we're going to need city, county, feds, state, all to play a massive role. I agree, automatic expungements are what we need to do. Every state going forward that legalizes, I hope, includes that in their legislation. It's really hard to do it after the fact. MILegalize did endorse both Dana Nessel and Gretchen Whitmer. I was at some of the work groups as well with Nestle, and, we got commitments from them that they were going to move forward with automatic expungements, and we have not seen that. In addition to pardons across the board for anybody that is incarcerated right now for something that would be legal. Let them out, get them out. What in the world is Michael Thompson still doing in prison? This is insanity. And now he's got COVID, and this is just, it just hurts. It hurts my soul. This is just awful. So we need way, way, way more people to get involved in this fight, in this movement. I see Margeaux, I see Denavia, I see like the usual suspects. There are not enough people working on this. There's a lot of people contacting, asking us what we're doing. We're doing everything we can, but there's only so many people can do. We need to build a much, much stronger movement with far more people. And the last thing I wanted to say was on this issue is other systems are still extremely problematic. Even though we have decriminalized and we have legalized, you still have entities like ICE that are deporting people, sending people back for marijuana because they got marijuana. Even though it's legal, they're picking them up anyways, saying it's federally illegal and deporting folks. CPS is another huge, huge issue for people that use cannabis, particularly the Black population is very targeted. And just because it's legal, CPS doesn't like it and they consider it a drug. And, nobody oversees CPS. They just do whatever they want. So for anybody out there, never let them in. Never, ever let them in. Get an attorney because they will mess your life up. Don't get me wrong. They do some important work here and there, but get an attorney, because they will make your life extremely difficult. So working on those systems as well, we think a lot about the police and different policies at the state level and city level, but we also got to be looking at what are sort of these behind the scenes, in the shadows entities that really continue to just make people's lives